Theme 7: Changing Cultural Tradition. From the 14th to the end of the 17th century, towns were growing in many countries of Europe. A distinct urban culture also developed. Townspeople began to think of themselves as more civilized than rural people. Towns, particularly Florence, Venice, and Rome, become centers of art and learning. Artists and writers were patronized by the rich and the aristocratic. The invention of printing at the same time made books and prints available to many people, including those living in distant towns or countries. A sense of history also developed in Europe, and people contrasted their modern world with the ancient one of the Greeks and Romans. Religion came to be seen as something which each individual should choose for himself. The church's art-centric belief was overturned by scientists who began to understand the solar system, and new geographical knowledge overturned the Europe-centric view that the Mediterranean Sea was the center of the world system. There is a vast amount of material on European history from the 14th century: documents, printed books, paintings, sculptures, buildings, textiles. Much of this has been carefully preserved in archives, art galleries, and museums in Europe and America. From the 19th century, historians use the term Renaissance, literally rebirth, to describe the cultural changes of this period. The historian who emphasized this most was a Swiss scholar, Jacob Burckhardt, 1818 to 97, of the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was a student of the German historian Leopold von Ranke, 1795-1886. Ranke had taught him that the primary concern of the historian was to write about states and politics using papers and files of government departments. Burckhardt was dissatisfied with these very limited goals that his master had set out for him. To him, politics was not the be-all and end-all in history writing. History was as much concerned with culture as with politics. In 1860, he wrote a book called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, in which he called his readers' attention to literature, architecture, and painting to tell the story of how a new humanist culture had flowered in Italian towns from the 14th to the 17th century. This culture, he wrote, was characterized by a new belief that man as an individual was capable of making his own decisions and developing his skills. He was modern, in contrast to medieval man whose thinking had been controlled by the church. The revival of Italian cities. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many of the towns that had been political and cultural centers in Italy fell into ruin. There was no unified government, and the Pope in Rome, who was sovereign in his own state, was not a strong political figure. While Western Europe was being reshaped by feudal bonds and unified under the Latin Church, and Eastern Europe under the Byzantine Empire, and Islam was creating a common civilization farther west. Italy was weak and fragmented. However, it was this very development that helped in the revival of Italian culture. With the expansion of trade between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic countries, the ports on the Italian coast revived from the 12th century as the Mongols opened up trade with China via the Silk Route. Theme and a trade with the Western Europe countries. Map the Italian states. Swiss Federation, Padua, Venice, Mantua, Bologna, Florence, Genoa, Adriatic Sea, Italian states, Rome, Corsica, Sardinia, Tyrrhenian Sea, Sicily, Mediterranean Sea. Also increased Italian towns played a central role. They no longer saw themselves as part of a powerful empire, but as independent city-states. Two of these, Florence and Venice, were republics and many others were court cities ruled by princes. One of the most vibrant cities was Venice, another was Genoa. They were different from other parts of Europe. The clergy were not politically dominant here, nor were there powerful feudal lords. Rich merchants and bankers actively participated in governing the city, and this helped the idea of citizenship to strike root. Even when these towns were ruled by military despots, the pride felt by the townspeople in being citizens did not weaken. The city-state. Cardinal Gasparo Contrani, 1483 to 1542, writes about the democratic government of his city-state in the Commonwealth and Governments of Venice, 1534. To come to the institution of our Venetian Commonwealth, the whole authority of the city is in that council, into which all the gentlemen of the city, being once past the age of 25 years, are admitted. Now first I am to yield you a reckoning how and with what wisdom it was ordained by our ancestor, that the common people should not be admitted into this company of citizens, in whose authority lies the whole power of the commonwealth, because many troubles and popular tumults arise in those cities whose government is swayed by the common people. Many were of contrary opinion, deeming that it would do well if this manner of governing the commonwealth should rather be defined by ability and abundance of riches. Contrariwise, the honest citizens and those that are liberally brought up oftentimes fall to poverty. Therefore, our wise and prudent ancestor ordered that this definition of the public rule should go rather by the nobility of lineage than by the estimation of wealth, yet with that temperature proviso that men of cheap and supreme nobility should not have this rule alone, for that would rather have been the power of a few than a commonwealth, but also every other citizen whosoever not ignobly born, so that all which were noble by birth or ennobled by virtue did obtain this right of government. G. Bellinis, The Recovery of the Relic of the Holy Cross, was painted in 1500 to recall an event of 1370 and is set in 15th century Venice. The 14th and 15th centuries, 1300, humanism taught at Padua University in Italy. 1341, Petrarch given title of poet laureate in Rome. 1349, university established in Florence. 1390, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales published. 1436, Brunelleschi designed the Duomo in Florence. 1453, Ottoman Turks defeat the Byzantine ruler of Constantinople. 1454, Gutenberg prints the Bible with movable type. 1484, Portuguese mathematicians calculate latitude by observing the sun. 1492, Columbus reaches America. 1495, Leonardo da Vinci paints the Last Supper. 1512, Michelangelo paints the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Activity 1. Locate Venice on the map of Italy and look carefully at the painting on page. How would you describe the city and in what ways was it different from a cathedral town? Comment this. Universities and humanisms. The earliest universities in Europe had been set up in Italian towns. The universities of Padua and Bologna had been centers of legal studies from the 11th century, commerce being the chief activity in the city. There was an increasing demand for lawyers and notaries. A combination of solicitor and record keeper to write and interpret rules and written agreement without which trade on a large scale was not possible. Law was therefore a popular subject of study, but there was now a shift in emphasis. It was studied in the context of earlier Roman culture. Francesco Petrarch 1304 to 78 represented this change. To Petrarch, antiquity was a distinctive civilization which could be best understood through the actual words of the ancient Greeks and Romans. He therefore stressed the importance of a close reading of ancient authors. This educational program implied that there was much to be learned which religious teaching alone could not give. This was the culture which historians in the 19th century were to label humanisms. By the early 15th century, the term humanist was used for master who taught grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. The Latin word humanities, from which humanities was derived, had been used many centuries ago by the Roman lawyer and essayist Cicero 1106 to 43 BC, a contemporary of Julius Caesar, to main culture. These subjects were not drawn from or connected with religion and emphasized skills developed by individuals through discussion and debate. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463-94, a humanist of Florence, wrote on the importance of debate in On the Dignity of Man, 1486. For Plato and Aristotle, it was certain that for the attainment of the knowledge of truth they were always seeking for themselves nothing is better than to attend as often as possible the exercise of debate. For just as bodily energy is strengthened by gymnastic exercise, so beyond doubt in these wrestling places of letter, as it were, energy of mind becomes far stronger and more vigorous. These revolutionary ideas attracted attention in many other universities, particularly in the newly established university in Petrarch's own hometown of Florence. Till the end of the 13th century, this city had not made a mark as a center of trade or of learning. But things changed dramatically in the 15th century. A city is known by its great citizens as much as by its wealth, and Florence had come. Florence, a sketch made in 1470. To be known because of Dante Alighieri, a layman who wrote on religious themes, and Giotto, an artist who painted lifelike portraits very different from the stiff figure done by earlier artists. From then, It developed as the most exciting intellectual city in Italy and as a center of artistic creativity. The term Renaissance man is often used to describe a person with very interest and skills because many of the individuals who become well known at this time were people of many parts. They were scholar, diplomat, theologian, artist combined in one. Giotto's painting of the child Jesus, Assisi, Italy, the humanist view of his story. Humanists thought that they were restoring true civilization after centuries of darkness, for they believed that a dark age had set in after the collapse of Roman Empire. Following them, later scholars unquestioningly assumed that a new age had begun in Europe from the 14th century. The term Middle Ages or medieval period was used for the millennium thousand years after the fall of Rome. In the Middle Ages, they argued the Church had had such simple control over man's mind that all the learning of the Greeks and Romans had been blotted out. The humanists used the word modern for the period from the 15th century. Periodization used by humanists and by later scholars, 5th to 14th century, the Middle Ages, 5th to 9th century, the Dark Ages, 9th to 11th century, the Early Middle Ages, 11th to 14th century, the Late Middle Ages, 15th century onwards, the Modern Age. Recently, historians have questioned this division with more research being done and more being found out about Europe. In this period, scholars are increasingly reluctant to make sharp divisions between centuries in terms of being culturally vibrant or otherwise. It seems unfair to label any period as the Dark Ages. Science and philosophy, the arts' contribution. Much of the writing of the Greeks and Romans had been familiar to monks and clergymen through the Middle Ages, but they had not made this widely known. In the 14th century, many scholars began to read translated works of Greek writers like Plato and Aristotle. For this, they were indebted not to their own scholar but to Arab translators who had carefully preserved and translated ancient manuscript. Plato was Aflatun, and Aristotle Aristu in Arabic. While some European scholars read Greek in Arabic translation, the Greek translation works of Arabic and Persian scholars for further transmission to other Europeans. These were work on natural sciences, mathematics, astronomy written in Greek before 140 CE and later translated into Arabic, carries the Arabic definite article al, which brings out the Arabic connection. Among the Muslim writers who were regarded as men of wisdom in the Italian world were Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Latin 980 to 1037, an Arab physician and philosopher of Bukhara in Central Asia, and Al-Razi Razas Rajis, author of a medical encyclopedia, Ibn Rushd, Averroes in Latin 1126-98, and Arab philosophers of Spain tried to resolve the tension between philosophical knowledge, philosophy, and religious belief. His method was adopted by Christian thinkers. The European spelling of these individual names made later generations think they were Europeans. Schools at these times were only for boys. Humanists reached out to people in a variety of ways through the curricula, and universities continued to be dominated by law, medicine, and theology. Humanist subjects slowly began to be introduced in schools, not just in Italy but in other European countries as well. Artists and realisms. Formal education was not the only way through which humanists shaped the minds of their rich art, architecture, and books were wonderfully effective in transmitting humanist ideas. Art is embedded in nature. He who can extract it has it. Moreover, you may demonstrate much of your work by geometry. The more closely your work abides by life in its form, so much the better will it appear. No man shall ever be able to make a beautiful figure out of his own imagination unless he has well stored his mind by much copying from life. Albrecht Dürer, 1471 to 1528. The sketch by Dürer playing hands gives us a sense of Italian culture in the 16th century, when people were deeply religious but also had a sense of confidence in man's ability to achieve near perfection and to unravel the mysteries of the world and the universe. Playing hands, Bruce drawing by Dürer, 1508. The Pieta by Michelangelo depicts Mary holding the body of Jesus. Artists who are inspired by stunning works of the past, the material remains of Roman culture were sought with as much excitement as ancient texts. 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, fragments of art were discovered in the ruins of ancient Rome and other deserted cities. Their admiration for the figures of perfectly proportioned men and women sculpted so many centuries ago made Italian sculpture want to continue that tradition. In 1416, Donatello, 1386 to 1466, broke new ground with his lifelike status. Artist concerned to be accurate was helped by the work scientist to study bone structure. Artists went to the laboratories of medical schools. Andres Vesalius, 1514 to 64, a Belgian and professor of medicine at the University of Padua, was the first to dissect the human body. This was the beginning of modern physiology. This self-portrait is by Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, who had an emerging range of interest from botany and anatomy to mathematics and art. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. One of his dreams was to be able to fly. He spent years observing birds in flight and designed a flying machine. He signed his name Leonardo da Vinci, disciple of experiment. Painters did not have older works to use them as a model, but they, like sculpture, painted as realistically as possible. They found that a knowledge of geometry helped them understand perspective and that by nothing the changing quality of light. The pictures acquired a three-dimensional quality. The use of oil as a medium for painting also gave a greater richness of color in many paintings. There is evidence of the influences of Chinese and Persian art made available to them by the Mongols with him. Thus, anatomy, geometry, physics, as well as a strong sense of what was beautiful gave a new quality to Italian art, which was to be called realism and which continued till the 19th century. Activity 2 describes the different scientific elements in the work of 16th century Italian artists. Architecture. Italian architecture is the 16th century copied many features of imperial Roman buildings. The city of Rome revived in a spectacular way in the 15th century. From 1417, the popes were politically stronger because the weakness caused by the election of two rival popes since 1378 had ended. They actively encouraged the study of Rome's history. The ruins in Rome were carefully excavated by archaeologists. Archaeology was a new skill. This inspired a new style in architecture, which was actually a revival of the imperial Roman style, now called classical. Popes, wealthy merchants, and aristocrats employed architects who were familiar with classical architecture. Artists and sculptors were also to decorate buildings with paintings, sculptures, and reliefs. Some individuals were skilled equally as painters, sculptors, and architects. The most impressive example is Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, immortalized by the ceiling he painted for the Pope in the Sistine Chapel, the sculpture called the Pieta, and his design of the dome of St. Peter's Church, all in Rome. Filippo Brunelleschi, 1337 to 1446, the architect who designed the spectacular Duomo of Florence, had started his career as a sculptor. Another remarkable change was that from this time artists were known individually by name, not as members of a group or a guild as earlier. The first printed books. If people in other countries wanted to see paintings, sculptures, or building of great artists, they had to travel to Italy. But in the case of the written word, what was written in Italy traveled to other countries. This was because of the greatest revolution of the 16th century. The mastery of the technology of printing. For this, Europeans were indebted to other peoples, the Chinese for printing technology, and to Mongol rulers because European traders and diplomats had become familiar with it during visits to their courts. This was also the case with the three other important involves. This was also the case with three other important innovations: Farham, the compass, and the abacus. The Duomo, the Dome of Florence Cathedral designed by Brunelleschi. Leon Battista Alberti, 1404 to 72, wrote on art theory and architecture hymn. I call an architect who is able to devise and to complete all those works which by the movement of great width and by the conjunction and amassment of bodies can with the greatest beauty be adapted to the uses of mankind. Earlier texts existed in a few handwritten copies. In 1455, 150 copies of the Bible were printed in the workshop of Johannes Gutenberg. 1400 to 1458, the German who made the first printing press. Earlier, a monk would have taken the same amount of time to write out one copy of the Bible. By 1500, many classical texts, nearly all the Latin, had been printed in Italy. As printed books became available, it was possible to buy them, and students did not have to depend solely on lecture notes. Ideas, opinions, and information moved more widely and more rapidly than ever before. A printed book promoting new ideas could quickly reach hundreds of readers. This also made it possible for individuals to read books since it was possible to buy copies for oneself. This developed the reading habit among people. The chief reasons that the humanist culture of Italy spread more rapidly across the Alps from the end of the 15th century is that printed books were circulating. This also explains why earlier intellectual movements had been limited to particular regions. A new concept of human beings. One of the features of humanist cultures was a slackening of the control of religion over human life. Italians were strongly attracted to material wealth, power, and glory, but they were not necessarily religious. Francesco Barbaro, 1392-1454, a humanist from Venice, wrote a pamphlet defending acquisition of wealth as a virtue. In On Pleasure, Lorenzo Valla, 1406 to 1457, who believed that the study of history leads man to strive for a life of perfection, criticized the Christian injunction against pleasure. There was also a concern at this time with good manners, how one should speak politely and dressed correctly, what skill a person of culture should learn. Humanism also implied that individuals were capable of shaping their own lives through means other than the mere pursuit of power and money. The ideals was closely tied with the belief that human nature was many-sided, which went against the three separate order the feudal society believed in. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote about human nature in the 15th chapter of his book The Prince, 1513. So, leaving aside imaginary things and referring only to those which truly exist, I saw that whenever men are discussed, and especially princes, who are more exposed to view, they are noted for various qualities which earn them either praise or condemnation. Some, for example, are held to be generous, and others miserly. Some are held to be benefactors, others are called grasping, some cruel, some compassionate, one man faithless, another faithful, one man effeminate and cowardly, another fierce and courageous, one man courteous, another proud, one man lascivious, another pure, one guileless, another crafty, one stubborn, another flexible, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another skeptical, and so forth. Machiavelli believed that all men are bad and ever ready to display their viscous nature partly because of the fact that human desires are insatiable. The most powerful motive Machiavelli saw as the incentive for every human action in self-interest. The aspirations of women. The new ideal of individuality and citizenship excluded women, men from aristocratic families, dominated public life, and were the decision makers in their families. They educated their sons to take their place in family businesses or in public life at times, sending their younger sons to join the church, although their dowries were invested in the family businesses. Women generally had no say in how their husbands should run their businesses. Often marriages were intended to strengthen business alliances. If an adequate dowry could not be arranged, daughters were sent to convent to live the life of a nun. Obviously, the public role of women was limited and they were looked upon as keepers of the households. The positions of women in the families of merchants, however, was somewhat different. Shopkeepers were very often assisted by their wives in running the shop. In families of merchants and bankers, wives looked after the businesses when the male members were away on work. The early death of a merchant compelled his widow to perform a larger public role than was the case in aristocratic families. In few women were intellectually very creative and sensitive about the importance of a humanist education. Even though the study of letter promises and offers no reward for women and no dignity, wrote the Venetian Cassandra Fedeli, 1465 to 1558. Every woman ought to seek and embrace these studies. She was one of the handful of women who questioned the idea that women were incapable of achieving the qualities of a human scholar. Fedeli was known for her proficiency in Greek and Latin and was invited to give orations at the University of Padua. Isabella d'Este. Fedeli's writing bring into focus the general regards for education. In that age, she was one of the many Venetian women writers who criticized the Republic for creating a highly limited definition of freedom that favored the desire of men over those of women. Another remarkable woman was the Marchesa of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, 1474 to 1539. She ruled the state while her husband was absent, and the court of Mantua, a small state, was formed of for its intellectual brilliance. Women's writing revealed their conviction that they should have economic power, property, and education to achieve an identity in a world dominated by men. Activity 3. Compare the aspiration of women expressed by women Fedeli and by a man Castiglione. Dare they have only women of a particular class in mind? Comment this. Balthasar Castiglione, author and diplomat, wrote in his book The Courtier 1528, I hold that a woman should in no way resemble a man as regards her ways, manners, words, gestures, and bearing. Thus, just as it is very fitting that a man should display a certain robust and sturdy manliness, so it is well for a woman to have a certain soft and delicate tenderness, with an air of feminine sweetness in her every movement, which in her going and staying and whatsoever she does always makes her appear a woman, without any resemblance to a man. If this percept be added to the rules that these gentlemen have taught the courtier, then I think that she ought to be able to make use of many of them, and adorn himself with the finest accomplishments, for I consider that many virtues of the mind are as necessary to a man as to a man. It is as it is to be of good family, to shun affection, to be naturally graceful, to be well mannered, clever, and prudent, to be neither proud, envious, or evil tongued, nor vain, to perform well and gracefully the sports suitable for women. Debates within Christianity. Trade and travel, military conquest, and diplomatic contracts linked Italian towns and court. Within the world behind the new culture was admired, and imitated by the educated and the wealthy. Very few of the new ideas filtered down to the ordinary man who, after all, could not read or write. In the 15th and early 16th centuries, many scholars in universities in North Europe were attracted to humanist ideas like their Italian colleagues. They too focused on classical Greek and Roman texts along with the holy books of the Christians. But unlike Italy, where professional scholars dominated the humanist movement in North Europe, humanism attracted many members of the church. They called on Christians to practice religion in the way laid down in the ancient text of their religions, discarding unnecessary rituals which they condemned. As later addition to a simple religion, there was a radically new view of human beings as free and rational agents. Later philosophers were to return to this over and over again, inspired by the belief in a distant God who created man but allowed him complete freedom to live his life freely in pursuit of happiness here and now. Christians, humanists like Thomas More, 1478 to 1535 in England, and Erasmus, 1466 to 1536 in Holland, felt that the church had become an institution marked by greed, extorting money at will from ordinary people. One of the favorite methods of the clergy was to sell indulgences documents which apparently freed the buyer from the burden of the sins he had committed. Christians came to realize from printed translation of the Bible in local languages that their religion did not permit such practices. In almost every part of Europe, peasants began to rebel against the taxes imposed by the church, while the common folk resented the extortions of churchmen. Princes found their interference in the work of the state irritating. They were pleased when the humanists pointed out that the clergy claims to judicial and fiscal power originated from the document called the Donation of Constantine, supposed to have been issued by Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. Humanist scholars were able to point out that this was not genuine and had been forged later. In 1517, a young German monk called Martin Luther 1483 to 1546 launched a campaign against the Catholic Church and argued that a person did not need priests to establish contact with God. He asked his followers to have complete faith in God, for faith alone could guide them to the right life and entry into heaven. This movement, called the Protestant Reformation, led to the churches in Germany and Switzerland breaking their connection with the Pope and the Catholic Church. In Switzerland, Luther's ideas were popularized by Ulrich Zwingli, 1484 to 1531, and later by Jean Calvin 1509 to 64. Backed by merchants, the reformer had greater popular appeal in towns, while in rural areas the Catholic Church managed to retain its influence. Other German reformers like the Anabaptists were even more radical. They blended the idea of salvation with the end of all forms of social oppressions. They said that since God had created all people as equal, they were not expected to pay taxes and had the right to choose their priest. This appealed to peasants oppressed by feudalism. The New Testament is a section of the Bible dealing with the life and teaching of Christ and his early followers. William Tyndale, 1494 to 1536, an English Lutheran who translated the Bible into English in 1506, defended Protestantism. Thus, in this day, we all agreed to drive you from the knowledge of the Scripture, and that ye shall not have the text therefore in the mother tongue, and to keep the world still in darkness, to the intent they might sit in the consciousness of the people, through vain superstition and false doctrine, to satisfy their proud ambition and insatiable covetousness, and to exact their own honor above king and emperor, yeah, and above God himself. Which thing only moved me to translate the New Testament, because I had perceived by experience how that it was impossible to establish the lay people in any truth except the Scripture were plainly laid before their eyes in their mother tongue, that they might see the process, order, and meaning of the text. Luther did not support radicalism. He called upon German rulers to suppress the peasants' rebellion, which they did in 1525. But radicalism survived. The march with the resistance of Protestants in France, who, persecuted by the Catholic rulers, started claiming the right of a people to remove an oppressive ruler and to choose someone of their own liking. Eventually, in France, as in many other parts of Europe, the Catholic Church allowed Protestants to worship as they chose. In England, the rulers ended the connection with the Pope. The king or queen was from then onwards the head of the church. The Catholic Church itself did not escape the impact of these ideas and began to reform itself from within. In Spain and in Italy, Churchmen emphasized the need for a simple life and service to the poor. In Spain, Ignatius Loyola, in an attempt to combat Protestantism, set up the Society of Jesus in 1540. His followers were called Jesuits, whose mission was to serve the poor and to widen their knowledge of other cultures. Activity 4. What were the issues on which the Protestants criticized the Catholic Church? Comment this. The 16th and 17th centuries. 1516 Thomas More, Utopia published. 1517 Martin Luther writes the 95 Theses. 1522 the Luther translated the Bible into German. 1525 Peasant uprising in Germany. 1543 Andrews Vesalius writes on anatomy. 1559 Anglican Church established in England with the king or queen as its head. 1569 Gerhardus Mercator prepares cylindrical maps of the earth. 1582 Gregorian calendar introduced by Pope Gregory XIII. 1628 William Harvey links the heart with blood circulation. 1673 Academy of Science set up in Paris. 1687 Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica published. The Copernicum Revolution. Celestial means divine or heavenly, while terrestrial implies having a worldly quality. The Christian notions of man as a sinner was questioned from an entirely different angle by scientists. The turning point in European science came with the work of Copernicus 1473-1543. A contemporary of Martin Luther, Christians had believed that the earth was a sinful place and heavy burden of sin made it immobile. The earth stood as the center of the universe around which moved the celestial planet. Copernicus asserted that the planets, including the earth, rotate around the sun. A devout Christian, Copernicus was afraid of the possible reaction to his theory by traditionalist clergymen. For these reasons, he did not want his manuscript, De Revolutionibus, the rotation, to be printed on his deathbed. He gave it to his followers, Joachim Braticus. It took time for people to accept this idea. It was much later, more than half a century later, in fact, that the difference between heaven and earth was bridged through the writings of astronomers like Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, and Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. The theory of the Earth as part of a sun-centered system was made popular by Kepler's cosmographical mystery, which demonstrated that the planets move around the sun not in circles but in ellipses. Galileo confirmed the notion of the dynamic world in his work The Motion. This revolution in science reached its climax with Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation, self-portrayed by Copernicus. Reading the universe. Galileo once remarked that the Bible that lights the road to heaven does not say much on how the heavens work. The work of this thinker showed that knowledge, and distinct from belief, was based on observation and experiment. Once these scientists had shown the way, experiments and investigation into what came to be called physics, chemistry, and biology expanded rapidly. Historians were to label this new approach to the knowledge of men and nature the scientific revolution. Consequently, in the minds of skeptics and non-believers, God began to be replaced by nature as the source of creation. Even those who retained their faith in God started talking about a distant God who does not directly regulate the act of living in the material world. Such ideas were popularized through scientific societies that established a new scientific culture in the public domain. The Paris Academy, established in 1670, and the Royal Society in London for the promotion of natural knowledge, formed in 1662, held lectures and conducted experiments for public viewing. Was there a European Renaissance in the 14th century? Let us now reconsider the concept of the Renaissance. Can we see this period as marking a sub-break with the past and the rebirth of ideas from Greek and Roman traditions? Was the earlier period, 12th and 13th centuries, a time of darkness? Recent writers like Peter Burke of England have suggested that the workload was exaggerating the sharp differences between the period and the one that preceded it, but using the term Renaissance, which implies that the Greek and Roman civilizations were reborn at this time, and the scholars and artists of this period substituted the pre-Christian worldview for the Christian one. Both arguments were aggregated. Scholars in earlier centuries had been familiar with Greek and Roman cultures, and religion continued to be a very important part of people's lives. To contrast the Renaissance as a period of dynamism and artistic creativity and the Middle Ages as a period of gloom and lack of development is a oversimplification. Many elements associated with the Renaissance in Italy can be tracked back to the 12th and 13th centuries. It has been suggested by some historians that in the 9th century in France there had been similar literacy and artistic blossoms. The cultural changes in Europe at this time were not shaped only by the classical civilizations of Rome and Greece. The archaeological and literary recovered Roman culture did create great admiration of the civilization, but technologies and skills in Asia had moved far ahead of what the Greeks and Romans had known. Much more of the world had become connected, and the new techniques of navigation system enabled people to sail much further than had been possible earlier. The expansion of Islam and the Mongol conquest had linked Asia and North Africa with Europe, not politically but in terms of trade and learning skill. The Europeans learned not just from the Greeks and Romans, but from India, from Arabia, from Iran, from Central Asia and China. These depths were not acknowledged for a long time because when the history of this period started to be written, historians saw it from a Europe-centered viewpoint. An important change that did happen in this period was that gradually the private and the public spheres of life began to become separate. The public sphere meant the area of government and of the formal religion. The private sphere included the family and personal religion. The individual had a private as well as public role. He was not simply a member of one of the three orders. He was also a person in his own right. An artist was not just a member of a guild, he was known for himself. In the 18th century, the sense of the individual would be expressed in a political form in the belief that all individuals had equal political rights. Another development was that the different regions of Europe started to have the separate sense of identity. Based on language, Europe, earlier united partly by the Roman Empire and later by Latin and Christianity, was now dissolving into states, each united and by a common language. Exercise, answer in brief, answer in a short essay. Comment this.